That morning, the wind carried a strange stillness through the trees, as if the air itself was whispering a secret. In a small village nestled at the edge of a modern city, life moved quietly. Most of the residents were Christians, devoted to their churches, singing hymns on Sundays, and ringing the bells that echoed across the fields. It was a peaceful, humble place, until something extraordinary began to unfold. At the far end of the village, in a modest home made of old bricks and soft memories, lived a Muslim woman named Nurul and her 5-year-old daughter, Isa. Isa was not like other children. At first glance, she was just a little girl, tiny feet, curious eyes, soft voice. But there was something deeper in her presence. Her innocence wasn't just sweet, it was powerful. Her smile, when she prayed beside her mother, seemed to carry something sacred. Each night before bed, Nurul would recite du'as over her daughter. She had done so since Isa was a baby, her words gentle like rain, her voice laced with a love that came from faith. Even though she was just 5, Isa showed signs of unusual understanding. When she heard the adhan echoing faintly from a distant mosque, the only one in the village, she would stop what she was doing and listen quietly, her eyes closing for a moment, as if her soul recognized the call. She asked questions, not silly ones, but deep ones. "Mama," she once whispered, "why do people get angry when we talk about Allah?" Nurul smiled, gently brushing her daughter's hair. "Because sometimes, sweet child, truth makes people afraid. But we must never fear truth. We pray for them." But the village wasn't always kind. While Islam was the majority religion in the broader country, this little pocket of tradition remained firmly rooted in Christianity. Muslims were few and often left alone, not out of respect, but suspicion. Children at school sometimes ignored Isa. Some adults whispered when Nurul walked past. Yet she never responded with anger. She would smile, greet them softly, and hold Isa's hand a little tighter. One morning, everything began to shift. A large gathering was scheduled at the village's main church, a beautiful old stone building with stained glass windows and towering arches. A prominent priest, known across the region, was coming to deliver a special sermon. His name was Pastor Samuel. He was respected deeply, a man of commanding presence and passionate speech. Many called him the voice of the faithful. But what they didn't know was that Pastor Samuel had been struggling, quietly, painfully, with something no one suspected. The night before his sermon, Samuel had sat alone in his study, surrounded by religious texts. His Bible lay open before him, but his eyes wandered. He wasn't reading. He was reflecting. Lately, there had been a growing restlessness inside him. He felt a quiet tug in his heart, like a voice calling from somewhere far away. He remembered words he'd heard in passing, words about Islam, about peace, about the one God. He'd never studied it seriously. He had always dismissed it. But now, something was stirring. That same morning, Nurul and Isa were walking to the small market. As they passed the church, Isa stopped. Her eyes were drawn to the tall wooden doors. She had never been inside, but she often asked what was there. "It's where they pray, like we do," Nurul had told her once. "They seek God too, in their own way." Outside the church stood a few people preparing for the sermon. Among them was a younger priest, assisting with the arrangements. He noticed Isa looking toward the church and smiled politely. Isa, innocent and curious, walked up to him and said, "Assalamu alaikum, Pastor." The priest was taken aback. Not angry, just surprised. "Wa alaikum salam," he repeated awkwardly, unsure if he had said it correctly. Isa beamed. "My mama says we should always greet others with peace," she said. "Isn't peace beautiful?" He nodded, not knowing what else to say. But that short exchange stayed with him. And inside the church, where Pastor Samuel was preparing to speak, something else was beginning to change. When he took the podium, the church fell silent. Rows of people waited to hear him speak. He opened his sermon the way he always did, with authority, passion, and purpose. But as he spoke of love, of truth, of spiritual longing, his voice began to waver. His words were less certain. His message, though still eloquent, felt heavy. Some of the other priests exchanged glances. They could sense something different in him, a subtle hesitation, a shadow of doubt. Outside, Isa and her mother sat on a bench near the garden by the church. Isa looked at the tall cross atop the building, then up at the sky. She turned to her mother and asked softly, "Mama, if they pray too, why do people say we're different?" Nurul placed a hand on her daughter's heart. "Because hearts sometimes forget that truth doesn't belong to one place. But Allah knows what's inside every heart." Later that afternoon, Isa returned to the church alone. She stood quietly by the steps. The sermon had ended, and people were slowly leaving. She raised her small hands toward the sky and whispered, "Ya Allah, guide everyone who seeks you, even if they don't know they're seeking. Guide the pastor too. Show him your light." No one heard her prayer. No one, except the one who hears all. But from that moment on, something unseen began to shift. Inside the church, Pastor Samuel felt a strange calm descend upon him. He couldn't explain it. He had not heard Isa. He didn't even know her name. But he felt something. That night, he couldn't sleep. Her face, her eyes full of sincerity, kept appearing in his mind. The days that followed were filled with a strange kind of silence. Churchgoers began to feel unsettled. Some of them, without knowing why, started asking questions they had never asked. About faith. About peace. About what it really meant to know God. And in the center of all that silent movement was one little girl who had done nothing but smile, greet, and pray. And this was just the beginning. A few days passed, but the atmosphere in the village felt different, heavier, as though a silent wind was carrying questions from house to house. People who once passed each other with polite smiles now lingered in conversation, their voices lowered, uncertain. Inside the church, Pastor Samuel moved through the hallways with a strange stillness in his steps. His sermons were no longer filled with fire. He had begun pausing more during his messages, staring out into the rows of faces as if searching for something he couldn't name. And through it all, little Isa continued with her days as if nothing had changed. But change, it seemed, was following her. When she walked through the marketplace with her mother, a few shopkeepers greeted them more kindly than before. Others watched from a distance, curious. The same little girl who once went unnoticed was now being noticed, not for anything she said loudly, but for something much quieter, the calm she carried. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and cast a golden hue across the village, Isa asked her mother, "Mama, is it okay to pray for people who don't pray like us?" Nurul looked down at her daughter, surprised by the question. "Why do you ask, my love?" Isa thought for a moment, then replied, "Because I prayed for the pastor. I want him to be happy. I want him to know what we know." Nurul's eyes softened. She wasn't surprised, not really. "Yes, Isa," she said. "It is more than okay. It is beautiful." That same night, Pastor Samuel sat once again in his study. The room was dim, a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. Books lay open, their pages untouched. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the Bible. But this time, his eyes didn't fall on the verses, they drifted to a small, folded piece of paper that someone had slipped into the church's offering box earlier that day. It was a child's handwriting. The words were simple. "Islam is beautiful. May God guide us all." No name, no explanation. He didn't need one. He closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. That phrase, "Islam is beautiful," he had heard it before. Or perhaps, felt it. That little girl outside the church. Her eyes. Her prayer. Could this have come from her? His heart pounded in his chest. In the days that followed, strange things began happening in quiet ways. One of the senior priests, who had always stood firm in doctrine, approached Pastor Samuel and said, "I don't know why, but I can't stop thinking about what you said last Sunday, about love being bigger than tradition." Another member of the congregation requested to borrow a book, not from the church, but about other faiths. "I just want to understand," she said. "No harm in learning, right?" But not everyone welcomed this shift. In private corners of the village, meetings were held. Words like heresy and infiltration were whispered. And one voice in particular grew louder, a woman named Clara. Clara had been a part of the church for decades. Her father had helped build its foundation. To her, it wasn't just a place of worship, it was identity, memory, and loyalty. The changes she sensed unsettled her deeply. She watched Pastor Samuel closely during sermons, noticing the way his voice faltered, the way his eyes no longer gleamed with certainty. "He's doubting," she whispered to her husband one night. "He's letting strange ideas enter our sanctuary." Her husband said nothing, just nodded slightly. He too had noticed. But unlike Clara, he wasn't angry. He was curious. Meanwhile, Isa continued to shine like a quiet lantern in the dark. One afternoon, she stood outside the church again, her hands clasped together, eyes closed. She didn't speak this time. She just stood there, as if listening. A few people passed by, puzzled. Some smiled. One elderly man stopped and asked her gently, "What are you doing here, little one?" Isa opened her eyes and answered, "Waiting to see if hearts can hear silence." He chuckled. "That's a big thought for such a small girl." She just smiled. Inside, Pastor Samuel stood at the altar, preparing notes for the next sermon. But the words felt foreign. He stared at them, but they wouldn't land in his heart. He dropped the papers and walked outside, needing air. As he stepped out, he saw Isa across the yard, standing quietly. He froze. Their eyes met. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Isa walked up to him. "Hello, Pastor." "Hello, little one," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. "Are you okay?" she asked, with the simple kindness that only children possess. He nodded slowly. "I think I'm learning something new. But I don't know what it means yet." Isa looked at him and said, "That's what my mama says truth feels like, scary at first, but warm once you let it in." He couldn't help but smile. That night, Pastor Samuel wrote in his journal for the first time in months. He wrote about the girl. About the peace he felt when she spoke. About the questions growing louder in his soul. He wrote, "If truth is what I've always sought, why do I fear where it leads me?" At the same time, Nurul and Isa sat in their modest living room, a single lamp lighting the Qur'an on the table. Isa rested her head on her mother's lap. "Mama," she whispered, "will the pastor ever know Allah?" Nurul stroked her hair. "If Allah wills, Isa. Sometimes the smallest prayers travel the longest distance." And in the church, Pastor Samuel, once the strongest voice of conviction, now sat with trembling hands and a restless heart, not knowing that he had already begun to walk the path he feared most, the path toward truth. And the village had no idea that the faith of one little girl was about to shake every soul in ways they never expected. In the quiet village, where time seemed to move slowly and every Sunday the church bell rang like a lullaby of tradition, a wave of unrest had begun to ripple. What started as a whisper in the heart of Pastor Samuel was now echoing across pews and homes. Something had shifted, not just in him, but in the congregation that looked to him for guidance. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Isa first greeted the pastor. 2 weeks since her tiny voice and pure words had landed like raindrops on dry soil. And in those 14 days the soil had begun to crack, not with destruction, but with the possibility of something new breaking through. Inside his modest home, Pastor Samuel had stopped pretending. To himself, at least. Gone were the days of confident sermons and rehearsed lines. Each time he stood at the pulpit, he felt his voice tremble, his certainty fade. He could feel the eyes of the congregation, some puzzled, some worried, some quietly hopeful. The church elders noticed too. "He's different," whispered one to another during a planning meeting. "He speaks of love, but he's questioning doctrine." Another elder responded in a low tone. "I don't blame him. I've been questioning too." But not everyone welcomed doubt. Clara, who had grown up in the church, was furious. Her hands trembled as she folded hymn sheets. "This is not the man I used to admire," she told her close circle of friends one afternoon. "He's slipping. Letting strange influences enter our sacred space." One of the women replied, "Do you think it's that Muslim girl? The child?" Clara's eyes narrowed. "I think she's part of it. Her mother too. This isn't just curiosity anymore. It's infiltration." But no one said anything after that. Because deep inside, many of them had felt something too. A softness. A stirring. A quiet urge to ask what if. Meanwhile, Isa remained blissfully unaware of the conversations around her. For her, life was as it had always been, except she was praying more. Her tiny lips whispered duas during play, in the garden, even while tying her shoelaces. One evening she asked her mother, "Can the heart hear before the ears?" Nurul smiled. "Yes, Habibti. The heart often hears first. That's how Allah guides." Isa nodded slowly, absorbing the thought. That night she prayed with extra conviction. "O Allah, open every heart that is ready, even if the mind is not." That same night, Pastor Samuel couldn't sleep. Again. He walked through his home like a restless shadow, stopping by his study, then the kitchen, then finally back to his small prayer corner. He sat on the wooden bench and looked up. "God," he whispered, "if you are still listening to me, show me what I'm not seeing." The next morning, he made a quiet decision. He would visit Nurul and Isa. Not as a pastor. As a seeker. He arrived at their doorstep just before sunset, holding nothing but his hands in front of him and his doubts in his chest. The house was small, humble, and glowing with warmth. Nurul opened the door, surprised but calm. She greeted him with the kind of peace that made people let their guard down. "Pastor," she said gently, "we're honored." "I hope I'm not intruding," he replied. "Not at all. Please come in." Inside, Isa sat cross-legged on the rug, her Qur'an open in her lap. She looked up and smiled. "Hello, Pastor. Did your heart bring you here?" He blinked, stunned by her words. "Maybe yes," he replied slowly. They sat together, Pastor Samuel on one side, Nurul opposite, and Isa between them. Tea was poured. No one rushed. No religious lectures. No arguments. Just warmth. "I don't know what's happening to me," he confessed after a long pause. "I feel like something is unraveling inside. Something I thought was secure." Nurul responded softly. "Sometimes we build walls around ourselves in the name of faith. But faith isn't a prison. It's a journey. And journeys change us." He looked at her with moist eyes. "I'm afraid. Afraid of what this might cost me." Isa looked up and said, "Truth always costs something, Pastor. But it gives back more than it takes." Silence filled the room, not awkward but sacred. Pastor Samuel didn't convert that night. He didn't ask to read the Qur'an. He didn't debate theology. But something deep, something irreversible, had begun. He returned home quietly, heart trembling, mind spinning. But the village was not quiet. Word spread fast. "He visited the Muslims," they whispered. "He's lost his way." Some were outraged. Some confused. A few intrigued. Clara, upon hearing the news, was furious. She stormed into the church hall and confronted the elders. "You let this happen? He's gone to them. To her. That child." "Clara, calm down," an elder said. "We don't know his intentions." "Oh, don't we?" she snapped. "He's poisoning our church from the inside." But her voice was no longer dominant. A few elders remained silent. A few avoided eye contact. Because many had already started wondering. Because truth, when it arrives, doesn't knock loudly. It seeps in. That weekend, Pastor Samuel stood at the pulpit again. His hands trembled. He looked at the congregation, some hostile, some loving, some lost. He closed his notes. "I want to speak from the heart today," he began. And then, he paused. Outside the church, Isa stood beneath a tree. Her eyes closed, palms raised. She didn't know what was being said inside. But she whispered, "Guide them, Ya Allah. The ones who are ready. And the ones who are afraid." Inside the old church, sunlight streamed softly through stained glass windows, painting the pews in muted reds and blues. The congregation sat in silence. Some with arms folded. Some with hands trembling. All eyes were on Pastor Samuel. He stood motionless behind the wooden pulpit, his notes untouched. For the first time in years, he had no script, only a storm inside. I've been thinking," he finally said, his voice quiet but clear. "Thinking about the things we believe. The things we never question. The things we fear to explore." Murmurs rose among the congregation. Confusion. Concern. Curiosity. Pastor Samuel looked out at familiar faces, people he had guided, baptized, married, buried. People who trusted him. And now, he felt like a stranger to them. "I've always believed faith should bring peace," he continued. "But lately, I've found myself restless. Not because I've lost faith, but because I've begun to wonder, have we limited God to only what we're used to?" A gasp came from someone in the back. Clara, seated near the front, stared at him with disbelief. "What are you saying, Pastor?" she asked loudly. Samuel paused. The question wasn't a challenge, it was a lifeline. He took a breath. "I'm saying, I don't have all the answers. And maybe I never did. I've been meeting with people I once feared. I've listened to words I once rejected. And I've felt peace." The church fell into an uneasy silence. "I haven't converted," he added quickly, sensing the rising tension. "But I can't ignore the peace I feel when I listen, truly listen, to the words of Islam. To their prayers. To their submission to the one God." Whispers turned into voices. Voices into accusations. "He's lost his way. This is dangerous. Blasphemy." But there were also tears. Quiet tears. From those whose hearts had already started shifting. People who had felt the same confusion, the same pull towards something they couldn't name. "I'm not here to divide you," Samuel said. "I'm not asking you to follow me blindly. I'm asking you to think. To feel. To seek." Clara stood up. "You were supposed to lead us in Christ. Not question him." "I'm not questioning Christ," he said gently. "I'm questioning the box we've put truth inside." Clara walked out. Several followed her. But many remained. Outside, under the large oak tree near the churchyard, Isa stood watching the stained glass glow. Her small hands clutched her mother's. She didn't know what had happened inside. But she knew something had changed. Again. Later that evening, the village was buzzing. The church service had become the talk of every home. Some called for Pastor Samuel's removal. Others stayed quiet, unsure. And a few, a quiet few, came knocking on Nurul's door. "Can we talk?" a middle-aged couple asked. "Not to argue. Just to understand." Nurul welcomed them in, offered tea, and sat with patience. Isa peeked from behind a curtain, her face lit with quiet joy. They asked questions, sincere ones. About prayer. About the Qur'an. About why Muslims pray 5 times a day. About why they never depict God. And Nurul, with calm warmth, answered. There is no compulsion in Islam, she said gently. But there is clarity. We believe in one God. Without partners. Without images. And our peace comes from surrendering fully to Him. One of the visitors, an older woman with silver hair, nodded slowly. I always wondered why Muslims look so calm when they pray. It's like they're truly talking to someone. They are, Nurul replied. We all are. But Islam teaches us how to listen too. And so, night after night, small circles began to form. People came, secretly, quietly, to listen, not to convert, but to learn. The mosque in the neighboring village, once silent, began to see visitors it never had before. But change never comes without resistance. Clara organized a private meeting of her own. She gathered the most loyal members of the church, those who feared their traditions were under threat. They're trying to steal our pastor. Our faith. Our children, she warned. A man in the group asked. But what if it's not theft? What if it's truth? Clara's voice rose. Are you willing to throw away everything we've ever believed? But fear wasn't enough anymore. Something stronger was moving through the village. It wasn't argument. It wasn't force. It was presence. Isa's presence. Everywhere she went, people felt calmer. Her silence spoke more than their shouting. Her innocence made their certainties tremble. One day, Clara saw her in the market, sitting on a bench eating fruit with another Christian child. They were laughing. Sharing. No fear. No walls. She stared at the 2 children for a long time, something breaking inside her. That evening, Clara did something no one expected. She went to Pastor Samuel's house. I'm angry, she said the moment he opened the door. But I'm also confused. He stepped aside. Then you're already halfway to the truth. They sat, talked, and cried. Not about Islam. Not about conversion. But about fear, loss, and the terrifying beauty of change. And while the adults struggled, Isa continued praying. Every night. Ya Allah, keep the doors open. Don't let their hearts close before they hear you. The village was no longer the same. The wind had shifted. The walls had cracked. And behind every moment of change stood the smallest hands. The village no longer whispered, it buzzed. What began as quiet tension had evolved into an open spiritual storm. Lines were being drawn, not just between people, but within their own hearts. Families sat at dinner tables discussing religion in ways they never had before. Church elders were meeting more frequently. And in the center of this spiritual whirlwind stood a 5-year-old girl who never raised her voice, yet somehow, everyone could hear her. Pastor Samuel walked more slowly these days. Not because he was tired, but because the weight of what he carried was growing heavier. He was not only wrestling with his own questions, but with the burden of those who looked to him for answers. Every knock on his door brought new stories. I heard your sermon, said a man who had never missed a Sunday. It didn't sound like doubt. It sounded like you were finally speaking honestly. I've been thinking too, said a young woman, nervously twisting her scarf. Not about leaving the church, but about opening my heart wider. But for every voice of quiet support, there was another of loud resistance. We're losing our pastor, they said. This village is being tested. Clara, though more subdued than before, hadn't given up. She still believed Pastor Samuel was drifting, and feared the entire village might drift with him. Yet deep inside, something had softened. The angry fire had become an aching worry. She no longer blamed Isa. In fact, she hadn't been able to stop thinking about her. The way that little girl spoke. Her eyes. Her peace. She's just a child, Clara said one night to her husband. But why does it feel like she sees more than we do? Meanwhile, Isa's days remained simple. She played in the garden. She helped her mother bake bread. She recited her small surahs before bed. But every now and then she would stop in the middle of play, lift her hands quietly, and whisper, Ya Allah, don't let fear win. It was a Friday afternoon when Pastor Samuel finally visited the mosque. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't even prepare a speech. He simply got into his car, drove to the neighboring town, parked outside the modest white building, and stepped inside. No one recognized him. A few men greeted him politely. The imam smiled warmly and gestured to a seat. Samuel sat on the carpeted floor, heart racing. He watched. He listened. The Qur'an was being recited, slow, rhythmic, melodic. Even though he didn't understand the Arabic words, something inside him responded. The sound was not just beautiful. It was honest. After the prayer, the imam approached. You're not from here, he said kindly. Samuel nodded. I'm a pastor. The imam didn't flinch. He smiled. I'm not here to debate, Samuel added quickly. I just needed to be here. Then you're already welcome, the imam replied. They sat. Talked. No pushing. No conversion. Just two men, both servants of God, sharing tea and truth. Why do you pray the way you do? Samuel asked. Because God is near, the imam said. And when he is near, the body, the tongue, and the soul must all submit. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment. The simplicity struck him. Submit. Not debate. Not defend. Just submit. When he left the mosque that day, he felt lighter. Not resolved, but lighter. Back in the village, news of his visit spread, as things always do in small towns. Some were outraged. Some afraid. But many were silent. Not with judgment, but with thought. The next Sunday, the church was fuller than usual. People wanted to hear what he would say. To see if he had changed, or if he had left them. He stood before them, Bible in hand, but did not open it. I have not abandoned my faith, he said. I've deepened it. Some looked confused. Others leaned forward. I believe in truth. I believe in seeking. And I believe that God is not bound by fear. If your faith is shaken by a child's prayer, perhaps your faith wasn't resting on truth to begin with. A few people clapped quietly. Most just sat in stunned silence. I will continue preaching. I will continue serving. But I will no longer pretend to be blind where my heart is seeing. That evening, he visited Nurul's home again. This time, there was no fear in his eyes. Only stillness. Isa greeted him with a smile. Did the mosque help? She asked, like a child asking if he enjoyed the park. He chuckled. Yes, little one. More than I expected. Nurul prepared tea again. This time, Samuel brought something with him, a notebook filled with questions. They sat together for hours. Not as a pastor and a Muslim, but as people. As seekers. Isa sat in the corner, drawing a picture with colored pencils. When she finished, she held it up. It was a mosque and a church. Side by side. The sun above them. And two little stick figures, one in a dress, one in a robe, holding hands. This is you and me, Pastor, she said sweetly. He took the picture with trembling hands. That night he didn't sleep. Not out of unrest. But because he finally understood that peace is not the absence of questions, it is the presence of truth. By the time the next week unfolded, the village had become a mirror, each face reflecting some version of internal struggle. Some masked it behind loud voices. Some hid it in long silences. Others, like Pastor Samuel, had chosen to confront it directly. He was no longer the man he had once been. The suits he wore now felt heavier. The sermons, though still passionate, came from a different place. A place beyond loyalty to tradition. A place closer to truth. But truth comes with a price. Church attendance began to drop, not drastically, but noticeably. Some families, long-time attendees, stopped coming altogether. Others attended in awkward silence, eyes lowered, avoiding his gaze. Some young people, though, sat in the pews with renewed curiosity. They stayed after the service to ask questions. Not just about Christianity. About Islam. About faith. About the meaning of prayer and submission. Samuel never pretended to have all the answers. And that, ironically, made more people trust him. Meanwhile, Nurul's house had turned into something it had never been before, a refuge for the spiritually curious. There was no banner. No Dawah table. No arguments. Just warmth, tea, and space to breathe. Clara's husband, who had once avoided even greeting Nurul in public, now came once a week to sit silently in a corner, while she explained the meaning of Surah Al-Ikhlas. Another elderly woman, whose own grandson had left religion entirely, began asking questions about the hereafter. Even the local librarian had come to borrow an English copy of the Qur'an, something never before requested in that village. And Isa? Isa watched it all like the calm eye of a spiritual storm. She never boasted. Never said, "I caused this." She just smiled. Prayed. And continued being the same child who once said, "Why don't people talk nicely about religion?" But things weren't peaceful everywhere. In a nearby town, church leaders had heard of the commotion. One Sunday morning, two men in dark suits visited Pastor Samuel. "We represent the regional council," one of them said. "Your recent behavior has raised concerns." Samuel nodded. "I expected this. You're confusing people. They don't know what you stand for anymore." Samuel looked them in the eye. "I stand for God." "Which God?" That question echoed louder than it was asked. "I stand for truth," Samuel replied. "Wherever it leads. You're walking a dangerous line." "No," he said calmly. "I'm walking it carefully." When they left, he sat alone in the church for a long time. The wooden benches, the altar, the crucifix, all the symbols he had grown up with, now wrapped in new questions. But he didn't feel guilty. He felt guided. That evening, he returned to Nurul's home, no longer as a visitor, but as family. "I need to learn properly," he said. "Not just from books. From the heart." Nurul nodded. "The door is open." Isa brought him a small Qur'an. "It's in English," she said. "I read it with Mama sometimes. You can too." He held it like it was something sacred. Because to him, it was. From that day on, he visited regularly. Not to debate. To listen. He began fasting once a week, not as an obligation, but as practice. He learned the meanings behind prayers. The power of sajda. The humility of wudu. And slowly, his heart began to shift from, "Maybe this is right," to, "I know this is right." But he hadn't yet taken the step. Fear still lingered. Fear of losing everything. Fear of the public backlash. Fear of betraying the people who once trusted him. He shared these feelings one night with Nurul and Isa under the soft glow of a single lamp. "I'm ready," he said. "But I'm afraid." Isa, now curled up in her mother's lap, looked up and said, "Even prophets were afraid. But they walked forward." He smiled. Tears formed in his eyes. Nurul placed her hand over his. "You're not alone, Samuel. You never were." Meanwhile, Clara stood in the shadows of her own doubts. Her pride had slowly turned into reflection. Her resistance into silence. One night, she wandered outside and saw Isa sitting alone on the garden steps, gazing at the stars. Clara approached. She didn't plan to. It just happened. Isa, she said hesitantly. Isa looked up unfazed. Hi, Aunt Clara. Clara sat down beside her. I used to be angry with you. I know, Isa said. I thought you were causing trouble. I was just praying. Clara took a deep breath. Do you think God still listens to people who are confused? Isa leaned her head against her shoulder. That's when he listens most. Clara cried quietly. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. That same week, Pastor Samuel gathered the congregation for an announcement. The church was full, not just with members, but with visitors. People from nearby towns had come to hear the news. He stood before them, trembling. I have spent my life searching for God, he began. And I found him, not in just tradition but in truth. A truth that calls to the heart. A truth that submits to the one, with no partners. I have found that truth in Islam. Gasps. Cries. Silence. I know this will hurt some of you. But I cannot lie to you. I am embracing Islam. And with those words, the church, and the village, was never the same again. Some stood up and left in anger. Others wept. Some clapped. A few simply stared. But Isa, from the back of the hall, smiled. Because truth had spoken. And the earth had listened. The day Pastor Samuel embraced Islam, something shifted in the village forever. Not just in the hearts of those who supported him, but even more deeply in those who didn't. His declaration had not been made in defiance, but in peace. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince anyone. He simply stood, looked into the eyes of his congregation, and spoke from his heart. And the heart is the one place where truth can never be denied. Outside the church, news spread like wildfire. Some people couldn't believe it. Others pretended they hadn't heard. A few responded with venom. But most simply fell silent. Not because they were angry, but because they were unsure. How does one process the fact that a man who taught them faith for decades had now chosen something entirely different, and yet looked more at peace than he ever had? Clara didn't attend that final sermon. But she stood near the door, listening. Her face pale, her hands shaking. She had fought so hard against this change, against this child, against this unsettling peace that had taken over her village. But as she stood there, tears silently sliding down her cheeks, she realized the truth wasn't new. It had been here all along. It had just arrived through a path she didn't expect. That evening, Pastor Samuel, now just Samuel, walked through the village with no church title, no collar around his neck, and no official role. And yet, he had never felt more connected to God. He visited the mosque again that night. But this time, not as an observer. He performed wudu, feeling the cool water wash away years of confusion. He stood shoulder to shoulder with men he once avoided. And as he bowed, prostrated, and placed his forehead to the ground for the first time, tears soaked the carpet beneath him. Alhamdulillah alhamd, he whispered. O Allah, to you belongs all praise. Isa sat in the women's section with her mother, quietly watching from a distance. When Samuel finished his prayer, he looked back and saw her. She waved. He placed his hand on his heart and nodded. In that moment there were no sermons, no speeches, no applause. Just one heart finding its home. The days that followed were unlike any other in village history. Some families moved away, unable to accept what had happened. Others stepped forward, quietly asking to learn more. The mosque, once mostly empty, now had regular visitors, not all Muslims, but all seekers. Samuel, now going by Yusuf, didn't try to become a leader. He cleaned the prayer hall. He helped organize charity drives. He studied silently in the back during lessons. And slowly, the man who once stood above others began to walk among them, equal, humble, reborn. Isa visited him often. Sometimes with questions. Sometimes with dates or sweets. Sometimes just to sit beside him under the shade of a tree. "Uncle Yusuf," she once asked, "do you miss being a pastor?" He smiled. "I miss the people. But not the pretending." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I used to speak with confidence, but inside I had doubt. Now I speak less, but I feel truth." Isa nodded thoughtfully. "Mama says truth is like light. Even if you close your eyes, you can feel it on your skin." He chuckled. "Your mama is wise. And so are you." One afternoon, Clara came to the mosque. Not with anger. Not with arguments. Just questions. She didn't enter at first. She stood outside, nervously looking at the sign in Arabic, trying to remember the phrases Isa once spoke. A woman from the mosque approached gently. "Would you like to come in?" Clara hesitated. Then nodded. Inside, she didn't pray. She just sat on the carpet. Listening. Watching. And when the prayer ended, she asked a simple question. "Why do they cry when they bow?" The woman smiled. "Because that's when they feel closest to the one who hears everything." Clara didn't say anything more. She just closed her eyes. A few weeks later, she asked to attend one of Nurul's small gatherings. She didn't ask about doctrine. She didn't debate theology. She asked about peace. And found it. As for Isa, she remained the same. Still 5 years old. Still with wide eyes, messy braids, and tiny shoes that never stayed tied. But in the hearts of the village, she had become something more. Not a prophet. Not a preacher. Just a child with a pure heart, and that was enough. Legacy of Islam was not built through fame. It was built through sincerity. Not through noise. But through whispers. Not through arguments. But through du'as. And through the smallest voices, like Isa's, echoing through the largest halls. In the end, this was never about one pastor, one mosque, or one village. It was about something much bigger. It was about the way Allah guides whom He wills, through whom He wills. Sometimes through scholars. Sometimes through storms. And sometimes through a child who simply says, "Islam is beautiful." That night, a television studio in Denmark became the unexpected stage for a heated debate. What was supposed to be a casual interview slowly transformed into a tense exchange that no one had anticipated. Sitting confidently under the bright studio lights was a well-known journalist, Anders Mahler, a 61-year-old man with over 3 decades of experience in journalism. His graying hair added to his aura of authority, and his sharp gaze seemed capable of cutting through any lie. Opposite him sat a young girl named Sophia Nielsen, a 17-year-old Muslim who had recently become the talk of the Danish media. Sophia wasn't just any teenager. Her decision to embrace Islam a year ago had shocked many, especially considering she came from a prominent atheist family. But she wasn't just a convert. She was a brave young woman who stood firmly by her faith in the midst of Europe's dominant secular culture. The interview began with light questions: how Sophia first discovered Islam, and what had sparked her interest in it. Anders, in his usual probing style, tried to guide the conversation in a way that might make Sophia appear naive, like a young girl who didn't fully understand the consequences of her choice. But Sophia wasn't easily shaken. Her answers were calm, thoughtful, and free of any doubt. "You grew up in a country that values freedom," Anders said, leaning back in his chair. "We live without the need for religious rules. We can live however we want. So why would you choose a religion that, if I may be honest, seems to restrict women's freedom?" Sophia gave a faint smile. She had expected a question like this. With a soft but confident tone, she replied, "I chose Islam because I wanted true freedom." Anders raised his eyebrows, clearly not expecting that answer. He had assumed she'd say something cliché like, "Because Islam is beautiful," or, "It gives me peace." "Freedom?" he repeated, skeptical. "How can Islam offer freedom, when it imposes so many rules, especially on women? Sophia looked him directly in the eyes, unshaken. Freedom from what? She asked. What does freedom even mean? Is it doing whatever we want without limits? Is it abandoning the values that give life meaning? Anders paused, momentarily at a loss. But before he could respond, Sophia continued. I grew up in a society that rejected religion and taught us to follow our desires. But the more I learned, the more I realized that living without rules isn't freedom, it's just an illusion. True freedom is knowing your purpose and living with meaning, not simply chasing every impulse. The atmosphere in the studio began to shift. Even the crew, who usually stayed focused on their tasks, now found themselves watching the debate with growing interest. Anders tried to steer the discussion again. All right then. Are you saying that Islamic rules don't feel restrictive to you? Like the hijab, for instance? Or the rules about social interaction between men and women? Sophia smiled once more. Then let me ask you this. Don't we have rules in our society too? For example, we can't go to school without clothes. We can't walk into offices dressed however we like. We can't break the law without facing consequences. Aren't those rules too? Of course, Anders replied. But those are made to maintain order. Sophia nodded. Exactly. And Islam's rules are the same. Every rule Allah has given is not to suppress us, but to protect us. Just like we're not allowed to drive drunk because it's dangerous, Islam gives us guidelines to help us stay on the right path. Anders was starting to struggle. He hadn't expected such logical, well-grounded answers. But he wasn't ready to back down yet. Okay, he said. Let's talk about women. Don't you think Islam favors men over women? Sophia let out a gentle sigh. That's one of the biggest misconceptions I always hear. If Islam truly oppressed women, then why are so many women in Europe and America choosing Islam, despite all the negativity around it? No one's forcing them. They're choosing it willingly. Anders went quiet. He realized now that Sophia's words weren't rehearsed lines. They were the result of genuine thought and reflection. The debate was far from over, but one thing had become clear. Sophia Nielsen was no ordinary girl. That night's live broadcast, which had started out like any other, had captured the attention of viewers across Denmark. The studio fell quiet. Only the soft hum of the equipment and the occasional sound of a crew member shifting in their seat could be heard. What had begun as a simple interview had turned into a powerful intellectual exchange. Anders, known for his razor-sharp analysis and piercing questions, found himself face-to-face with a young woman who wouldn't be cornered so easily. Sophia remained composed, even under pressure. She wasn't someone who could be swayed by superficial arguments. Taking a deep breath, Anders leaned forward again. He had one more question, one that he hoped might expose a flaw. All right, Sophia, he said. If Islam is truly the perfect religion, as you say, then why are so many Muslim countries still underdeveloped? Then how do you explain all the wars, the conflicts, and the injustices we see in the world of Islam? Anders asked. Doesn't all of this prove that Islam doesn't bring progress? Sophia remained calm, her eyes steady. She had been expecting this. It's a classic question often used by skeptics to discredit religion, especially Islam. But she didn't rush to answer. She wanted her response to be thoughtful, not just reactive, to not only address the question, but also offer a deeper understanding. She looked at Anders with quiet confidence and asked, Does crime in a country mean that its legal system is flawed? If a doctor commits malpractice, does that mean all of medical science is unreliable? Anders was taken aback by the analogy. It caught him off guard. Still, he tried to hold his skeptical ground. But we're talking about Muslim countries in general, not just isolated individuals. Sophia offered a small, knowing smile. And the issue you've raised isn't about Islam itself, it's about people. Many so-called Muslim countries don't actually implement Islamic teachings properly. Many are led by corrupt leaders, plagued by broken systems, or manipulated by foreign powers and politics. Just as problems exist in other parts of the world, we can't blame the religion for what humans do wrong. Anders fell silent again. Sophia continued, her tone steady and thoughtful. Islam is not measured by the dysfunction of a country. It's a set of teachings, guidance meant to transform individuals. If you look at Muslims who truly follow those teachings, you'll see discipline, strong ethics, and deep intelligence. Anders narrowed his eyes slightly. He knew by now that Sophia wasn't someone he could unsettle with surface-level arguments. He had to go deeper, to touch something personal. Sophia, he said, you say Islam brings freedom. But don't you realize that by choosing Islam, you've placed yourself in a discriminated minority? Doesn't that hurt? Don't you worry that you've made a huge mistake by choosing a path filled with hardship? Sophia took a deep breath. She could feel a shift in Anders' tone. This wasn't just a journalist trying to trap her anymore. It felt like something else. Perhaps the genuine concern of an older man trying to understand the conviction of a brave young girl. She smiled softly. I understand exactly what you mean. I've faced mockery, insults, even threats. I've been called a traitor to my culture. Even my own family turned away from me. But Anders, haven't you noticed? Every major choice in life comes with a price. And for me, truth matters more than comfort. Anders watched her closely. There was something unshakable in her voice, no hesitation, no doubt. Aren't you afraid, Sophia? He asked. Afraid of what? She replied. Afraid of losing everything, your family, your friends, your future, all of it. Just because you chose Islam? Sophia looked down for a moment, her voice quiet when she spoke again. I have lost a lot, Anders. I lost the warmth of my family. I lost the friends who once stood by me. I lost the ease of belonging. But in return, I found something far more valuable, truth. And peace within myself. Anders didn't respond immediately. He hadn't expected this young girl to be so composed, so rooted in her beliefs. Still, he pressed on. Sophia, are you absolutely sure this isn't just a phase? So many teenagers your age feel lost. They experiment with new things, go through identity crises. What if one day you wake up and realize all of this was just a mistake? Sophia gave a soft smile, not in defiance, but in understanding. I appreciate your concern, Anders. But I'm not just a confused teenager trying to escape reality. I didn't choose Islam in a moment of emotional weakness. I studied it for months. I questioned everything. I challenged every belief I'd grown up with. I didn't just read books, I debated with academics, studied history, explored science, and tested every argument. She paused, then said firmly, If Islam were false, I would have found it. But the deeper I went, the clearer it became, this is the truth. Anders sat in silence for longer than before. Her words had struck something within him. In the control room, the producers realized that this wasn't the show they had originally planned. What was supposed to be a routine debate had turned into something extraordinary, a quiet but powerful confrontation between belief and skepticism. Outside the studio, social media was already exploding. Clips from the broadcast were going viral. Some praised Sophia's courage, while others criticized her. But one thing was undeniable. The entire nation was now talking about Sophia Nielsen. And yet, the debate wasn't over. Anders still had one final question, one he had saved for just the right moment. A question he hoped might finally shake her. He leaned forward slightly and asked, Sophia, if Islam is really the truth, then how do you explain the idea of an invisible God? Why should we believe in something that can't be proven scientifically? Sophia gave a small smile. She knew the heart of this conversation had finally arrived. This was the question where faith and reason most often collided. She took a deep breath and looked Anders directly in the eyes, unwavering. Sophia knew this final answer had to be more than just a philosophical argument. It needed to touch the hearts of everyone watching, including Anders. She had to make them feel the truth, not just hear it. She kept her voice soft but sharp. Anders, do you believe in love? He frowned slightly, caught off guard by the unexpected question. Of course, he replied. Everyone believes in love. Sophia gave a small smile. But have you ever seen love itself? I'm not talking about its expressions, like a hug or sweet words. I mean the actual form of love. Have you ever seen it with your eyes? Anders took a slow breath, beginning to sense where the conversation was headed. No, he admitted. I can't see love directly. But I know it exists, because I can feel it. I can see its effects on people. Sophia nodded. Exactly. We can't see love, but we believe in it because we see what it does. We see the sacrifices it inspires, the emotions it stirs, the things that go beyond logic or words. She looked deeper into his eyes. The same is true for God. I may not see him directly, but I see his signs everywhere. I see them in the perfect balance of nature, in the harmony of the universe, in the complexity of life that even our greatest scientists can't fully explain. All of it points to something higher. Anders blinked, the studio around them unusually still. Even the crew seemed to be holding their breath. But Sophia, Anders said gently, there are many scientists who argue that the universe doesn't need a God. They say everything can be explained through science. Sophia smiled knowingly. And has science explained everything, Anders? Can science tell us where consciousness truly comes from? Why morality exists? How something came from nothing? If we truly believe in science, then we must also accept its limitations. Even the most brilliant physicists admit there are mysteries they still can't solve. Anders leaned back in his chair, his tone no longer combative but curious. So you believe that faith in God is logical, not just emotional? Sophia nodded firmly. Faith and reason are not enemies, Anders. Islam never tells us to believe blindly. In fact, the Qur'an urges us to think deeply. Over and over Allah asks, do you not reflect? Do you not think? If you really want truth, you must be brave enough to question everything, even the beliefs you've grown up with. Anders rubbed his chin, clearly deep in thought. But you must understand, for many people, God is just a comforting idea, a way to feel safe in a world full of uncertainty. Sophia looked at him with genuine empathy. I understand. That's because many people only know God as a concept, not as a reality in their lives. But for those who seek him sincerely, his existence becomes more than just theory. It becomes something you experience. Anders didn't reply. For a moment, his decades of journalistic armor seemed to crack. There was something in Sophia's tone that wasn't just persuasive, it was real. All across Denmark, people were glued to their screens. Many who had once doubted the existence of God were now quietly reconsidering. But Anders wasn't done yet. Okay, Sophia, he said. Let's say God does exist. How do you know Islam is the right path? Why not Christianity, or Hinduism, or Buddhism? Sophia gave a gentle smile. That's a good question, Anders. It's the exact one I asked myself before I became Muslim. She inhaled deeply and continued. I studied many religions, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, even atheism. But only Islam gave me answers that were logical and complete. Anders raised an eyebrow. What do you mean by complete? Islam doesn't just talk about God, she explained. It explains our purpose, how to live a meaningful life, and what happens after death. It doesn't ask for blind belief, it asks us to think. And most importantly, the Qur'an is the only holy book that has remained unchanged since it was first revealed. No revisions. No versions. No contradictions. That's something no other scripture can claim. Anders knew the historical truth behind that. But hearing it spoken so clearly by a 17-year-old made something stir in him. Still, he didn't want to concede just yet. Sophia, he said seriously, how do you know all this isn't just your personal belief? A subjective experience? How can you be sure that what you feel isn't just an illusion? Sophia looked at him steadily. Anders, you've spent your life searching for truth in the outside world. But have you ever truly searched within yourself? He didn't respond. I'm not asking you to believe blindly. I'm asking you to do something simple. Seek the truth with sincerity. Open your heart. Read the Qur'an, not to criticize it, but to understand it. If you find flaws, walk away. But if you find something you can't disprove, then be brave enough to admit it. Anders felt a tightness in his chest. He had conducted countless interviews in his career, but this was the first time he felt he was the one being questioned. Sophia's voice softened. I know you're skeptical, and that's okay. The truth doesn't need to be defended. It speaks for itself, but only if you're willing to listen. The studio was silent. Something had shifted. Anders' eyes no longer carried the challenge of a journalist trying to win a debate. Instead, they held the quiet reflection of a man confronting something deeper within himself. He adjusted his tie. It suddenly felt much tighter than before. He hadn't expected this conversation to take him to a place where he'd begin to question the very truths he had always taken for granted. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. You speak of the Qur'an as if it's flawless, he said finally. But what about the contradictions critics claim to find in it? Many say some verses even oppose each other. Sophia remained calm. Whenever someone claims there are contradictions in the Qur'an, the answer always lies in context. Many critics cherry-pick verses, quoting without understanding. Anders, have you ever truly read the Qur'an from beginning to end, or just read what others have said about it? He didn't answer. But he didn't need to. Because in that moment, everyone, Anders, the studio crew, and the viewers across Denmark, understood one thing clearly. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a turning point. But Anders had to admit it. His understanding of the Qur'an was indeed limited. He continued, the Qur'an was revealed over a span of 23 years, in different situations and circumstances. If we pull out a single verse without understanding its background, of course we might misinterpret it. He leaned forward slightly. That's why in Islam, understanding the Qur'an isn't as simple as reading a translation. It requires knowledge of its interpretation, the historical context of its revelation, and how the verses interconnect. Anders leaned back in his chair. Sophia's arguments were strong, too strong to dismiss easily. But there was still one question weighing heavily on his heart. With a deeper tone, he asked, let's say the Qur'an is true and God exists, but there's one thing I still can't make sense of. Why is there so much suffering in the world? If God is all-merciful, why does He allow children to starve? Why does He permit wars and cruelty? The air in the studio turned heavy. This was the kind of question that struck at the soul, not just the mind. Sophia took a deep breath. She knew this wasn't just a philosophical query. It came from a place of pain, of lived experience. Maybe even from wounds Anders hadn't shared. I understand, Anders, she began gently. That's a question I once asked myself. If God is so good, why does the world hurt so much? She paused before continuing. But then I realized, we often see suffering only through a human lens. We judge what happens in this life without considering the bigger picture. We treat this world as the ultimate reality, when in Islam, this world is only a test. A short stop on a much longer journey. Anders looked at her, his eyes sharp with emotion. In Islam, Sophia explained, this life isn't the end. It's a proving ground. Every pain, every loss, every injustice, it's not meaningless. Justice is not always served here, but it will be served in the afterlife. This life is temporary. The next one is eternal. Anders gave a faint smile, but it wasn't mocking. It was thoughtful. So you're saying all this suffering is just a test? He leaned closer, his voice quieter now. How do you explain that to a mother who's lost her child? How do you tell her that it's just a test? Sophia looked at him deeply. I would never say that loss is easy. It isn't. But I believe that when God takes something from us, it's never without purpose. In Islam, every tear, every ache, every heartbreak, it's all recorded. It's all seen. And not a single drop of pain goes without reward. She leaned forward, her voice growing softer. Even when someone loses the person they love most, God promises them a reunion in paradise, if they remain patient and faithful. Anders nodded slightly. He had spoken to many people who suffered deeply, yet held on to hope. And now, hearing Sophia speak, it was clear why. In Islam, she continued, hope is a promise. We don't always know why something happens, but we trust that God is the most just, and that even our suffering can lead to something greater. Anders didn't speak right away. Her words had touched something in him, something he hadn't expected. He had come into this studio intending to test the young girl's faith. But now, it was his own certainty that was trembling. Taking a deep breath, Anders said in a calmer, more sincere voice, Sophia, I must admit, I didn't expect this conversation to go this far. But let me ask you one last thing. What makes you so sure? You speak as if you've never doubted your belief, not even once. Sophia smiled gently. Because I have doubted, Anders. I've questioned everything. But every question led me back to Islam. I found logic. I found evidence. But most importantly, I found peace. And I couldn't turn away from that. Anders nodded slowly. Something inside him had shifted, even if he couldn't fully describe it. The studio was silent. Time itself felt paused after Sophia's words. He didn't reply right away. He simply stared at her, a 17-year-old girl with a strength of faith that even decades of experience couldn't easily shake. Finally, he spoke again. You say your belief came from searching, from asking questions. But what if someone keeps searching and never finds the answers? Sophia took a deep breath. She heard the pain beneath the words, the quiet frustration of someone who had spent a lifetime looking outward, but maybe never truly looked within. Anders, she said softly, do you know why some people never find the answers? He looked at her. Because they search for what they want to hear, not for what is true. They seek confirmation, not understanding. They ask questions hoping the answers will match their desires, rather than being open to whatever the truth may be. Anders said nothing. The words hit a place he hadn't let anyone touch before. I used to be afraid too, she said. Afraid that the truth might challenge what I believed. But that's the beauty of real truth. It doesn't need to be forced. It speaks for itself, to a heart that truly wants to listen. Anders stared at Sophia for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he chuckled. Not out of sarcasm, but like someone who had just realized something profound. You know, he said, I've been in this profession for more than 30 years. I've interviewed world leaders, scientists, theologians, philosophers. But I've never felt this nervous in an interview. Sophia smiled gently. Why? Anders sighed deeply. Because it feels like I wasn't just interviewing you. I was being interviewed by my own conscience. He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting briefly to the ceiling before settling on her once more. I've always prided myself on thinking critically, on challenging other people's beliefs. But tonight, I feel like I'm the one who's been challenged. He paused. I've never truly studied Islam, not with an open heart. I've only read what the critics say, what the media says. I never asked the people who actually live it. Sophia didn't say anything. She just waited, giving him space. I always thought of religion," he continued, "as something rigid. Something full of rules that crush freedom of thought." But seeing Sophia today, Anders realized something. His discomfort with religion had never been about the faith itself. It had always been about people, those who misunderstood religion, misrepresented it, or never lived by its true values. Nodding slowly, Sophia added, "Islam isn't just a set of rules, Anders. It's a way of life. A life lived with purpose, with the awareness that we were not created without meaning." Anders looked at Sophia, this young girl with unshakable conviction, and then spoke, his voice softer than it had been all evening, almost a whisper. "Sophia, may I ask you something? Not as a journalist. Just as a human being, searching for answers." Sophia smiled gently. "Of course, Anders." He swallowed, gathering the courage to speak his next words. "If I wanted to know more about Islam, if I truly wanted to understand everything you've said tonight, where should I start?" Sophia's eyes lit up with warmth. "Start with one verse." Anders frowned slightly. "One verse?" She nodded. "Yes. Just one verse from the Qur'an. One that I believe will touch your heart." She took a deep breath, then recited the verse softly. "So whoever Allah wills to guide, He opens their chest to Islam." Qur'an, Surah Al-An'am, 6:125. Anders silently repeated the verse in his heart. There was something in those words that stirred something deep inside him. He didn't reply, he simply nodded, slowly. For the first time in his life, he felt as though a door he didn't even realize was closed had begun to open. Sophia saw it in his face, the subtle shift. This debate had never been about victory. It had been about unlocking something that had long been sealed within Anders' heart. "Anders," she said gently, "no one can force you to believe. Faith is never forced. It's not about being ready today. But if the day comes when you truly seek an answer, you'll know where to look." Anders took a deep breath, a small, sincere smile forming on his face. "I think, maybe I will read the Qur'an. Not to find fault, but to find understanding." Sophia smiled warmly. "That's a good step." This night had not been about a battle of ideas. It was about discovery. About a respected journalist and a brave young woman engaging not in conflict, but in conversation. It was about the courage to ask, and the sincerity to listen. Sophia showed that strong belief doesn't come from blind acceptance, but from deep searching. She had questioned everything, challenged every idea, and only then embraced Islam, not because it was convenient, but because it filled her soul. Anders, on the other hand, represented many people, intelligent, thoughtful, curious, but hesitant. Not because they rejected the truth, but because they hadn't yet seen it clearly, or from the right perspective. And that is the true message of this story. Everyone is on their own journey. Not everyone reaches the truth at the same time. But what matters most is that we keep searching, keep asking, and keep our hearts open when the truth presents itself. My dear friends, Legacy of Islam family, this isn't just a story. It's a reflection. A reminder for all of us. Too often, we judge what we don't understand. Too often, we ask questions, not to seek truth, but to defend our own views. But as you've seen in this story, the truth is always there, for those who sincerely want to find it. So let's be seekers. Let's ask, not to argue, but to understand. Let's listen, not just with our ears, but with our hearts. Thank you for watching and supporting Legacy of Islam. See you in the next story, one that will, once again, warm your heart and open your mind.